Hello my dear friends, welcome once again to Garhdo Goes Geek. On today's episode, I am going to be taking a look at Stan the Man Lee, one of the founders of Marvel Comics, one of the most influential names in the genre, and a rather celebrated figure despite some divisive things in his past. However, to do something a bit different, rather than talk about the man himself, because I have very mixed opinions on the man and I don't know enough about him, I thought instead, as a good way of celebrating his 100th birthday, it might be interesting to look at and rank all of his cameos across the many Marvel films and properties in which he has appeared. So, I hope you join me for this one. So, Stan Lee is a man that should probably need very little introduction to in most geek circles. He was born Stanley Martin Lieber, December 28th, 1922. He became an American comic book writer and then eventually editor, publisher, and producer, rising through the ranks of family-run business then known as Timely Comics. His first published work, I think, was a prose story in Captain America, but he would later go on to create several of the most famous characters at Marvel Comics, which is what Timely would evolve into in the 60s. He remained with Marvel as their primary creative leader for 2 decades and helped to lead the expansion of the company from a small division of a larger publishing house onto a multimedia company in its own right that went on to dominate both the comic and film industries. His most famous characters created at Marvel, particularly with the rest of the Marvel bullpen, but most especially co-writers and artists Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, are the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the X-Men, specifically the original X-Men, Iron Man, Thor, the Hulk, Ant-Man, the Wasp, Black Panther, Daredevil, Doctor Strange, the Scarlet Witch, and Black Widow, along with many others. He also saw the reintroduction of characters, of early Timely characters, Captain America and the Submariner, into the modern Marvel age. Went on to create the original iterations of major supervillains, including the Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, Magneto, Doctor Doom. Many of the classic Marvel characters are characters that Stan Lee had a direct hand in at some point in their history. He ended up pioneering a very naturalistic approach to comic book storytelling. Something called the Marvel method was something that he helped pioneer, which is where he would give his co-artists a loose plot outline, have them draw the entire issue, and then he would fill in the words that the characters were actually saying based on the pages that he got back. And this was how he wrote most of his stories, from Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, X-Men, the Hulk, Doctor Strange, and so on, right through to the Avengers as well. He was the one that helped create the Avengers by bringing some of Marvel's biggest heroes at the time together. And in fact, he created the biggest change in the Avengers by removing several of those big names from them. When the Avengers originally appeared, it was a team up of Ant-Man, the Wasp, Thor, the Incredible Hulk, although he left in the second issue, and Iron Man. They were then joined by Captain America. And after a few, by issue 16, he had become sick of the constant questions of, well, if Thor's in this mission in his own title, when does he have time for this Avengers mission, and so on. And so he actually wrote out all of the characters who had their own titles, with the exception of Captain America, because Captain America's title at the time was set during the 40s, and gave a new Avengers team of Hawkeye, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver, which became known as Cap's Kooky Quartet. So yeah, a lot of innovation done due to laziness, almost. In the 1970s as well, Stan Lee became one of the biggest challengers of the Comic Code Authority, and as a result, he indirectly led to a lot of changes in its policies. He did things like he decided to tell a drug story featuring Harry Osborn. And he was then responsible, after he stopped writing comics regularly throughout the 80s and 90s, he was responsible for pursuing the development of Marvel properties into other media, so cartoon shows, films, and there were mixed results across the years, but despite his retirement from Marvel in the 90s, he remained a public figurehead for the company, to the point that then led to him frequently making cameo appearances in films and television shows based on Marvel Comics. And in fact, for a lot of them, he also received an executive producer credit, which allowed him to become one of the highest grossing people in films of all time. He did also continue some independent creative ventures until his death. Working on other comics and other titles and even other cartoon series that were all outside of Marvel's purview. But it's his work with Marvel that he is most well known for. And in the modern day, it's those cameos that he is most well known for. And so the cameos are the things I wanted to look at, because Stan the Man himself has a lot of complicated history in comics, and a lot of it is not very well known. There's been allegations from other creators of stealing credit, or gaining a lot of the credit perhaps unintentionally. There was quite a big divide between himself and Jack Kirby. Steve Ditko as well was also didn't have very many nice things to say about him, although Steve Ditko did recognise that he was working under contract, and so he got what he got out of it. There's also decisions that he made while running Marvel that led to a lot of uncomfortableness and a lot of people leaving the industry, such as his promotion of Jim Shooter to editor-in-chief, which was announced quite early and led to a lot of people leaving Marvel Comics. Jim Shooter was a very divisive figure at Marvel. But, for better or worse, Stan Lee is a beloved figure. And, there's a lot of things that I have read about him which are quite controversial, but there's not enough of it that's been explored in enough depth to really discuss, I don't think. And, despite any negative press that I think he's attained, I think he is much more well known for the positive creation of his work and the positive things he's done with it, the positive stories he's told, and the ways in which he's promoted the positivity around his characters. Things like the Stan Lee soapboxes in the pages of Marvel Comics, where he directly interacted with fans, his convention appearances, interviews he gave throughout the years, and of course his cameos. And it's the cameos themselves that I want to talk about today. I have written a list of all of his cameos across many, many films and television projects that I want to discuss. There's lots of visual cameos that I'm not counting. You know, for example, he's drawn into an episode of Superman's animated series. You know, there's his cameos in the Defenders properties on Netflix as police officer Irving Forbush. And, you know, so many cameos in the comics over the years, but specifically his cameos in film and television. And I decided it might be fun to rank them. And it felt somewhat sacrilegious doing it, because I had to really weigh up why I felt one cameo was better than another. Which is a hard thing to do and a hard thing to quantify. But I have my list, and I plan on sharing it with you. So, let's get into it. Now, while there are a lot of cameos that I am counting, and I'm going to be counting down, there are a couple of honourable mentions that I wanted to make first. Firstly, is my first real experience of Stan Lee himself, which was the Spider-Man 2000 PS... Well, was it 2000? The Spider-Man PlayStation 1 game, anyway. Late 90s, I believe it was. Now, Stan Lee in that appears as the narrator, and he's a lot of fun. He narrates every level, pretty much. There's like a brief narration at the start of pretty much every level from him. And it's a lot of fun. Like I said, I was vaguely aware of who Stan Lee was. Like, I'd been reading the comics for a while by this point. And obviously I'd seen his brief introductions on the Marvel Action Hour in front of the Fantastic Four and Iron Man cartoons. But this was my first real experience of Stan Lee. The first time I heard things like Excelsior and Nuff Said and, you know, all those catchphrases that, you know, show his passion for the characters that he created. And it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. Something that came out not long after that as well, or at least I saw it for the first time not long after that, was his cameo appearance in, I believe it's the very final episode of the Spider-Man 1994 cartoon series, the animated series, where Spider-Man gets sent to the, quote, real universe and meets Stan Lee, a man who writes him in a comic book. And you get a nice interaction between Spider-Man and Stan Lee, and it's lovely. You know, it's great seeing him interact with, you know, one of his most well-known characters, which is part of the joy of these cameos anyway, is seeing him interact with these characters and these worlds. And yeah, this was definitely one of his better ones. Three others that I wanted to mention as honourable mentions that I haven't counted for various reasons among the main list. The first is Big Hero 6, mainly because in Big Hero 6, Stan Lee is, while he is a post-credits cameo, they have developed him in the series into someone a bit more important. He is Fred's father, he is a superhero himself. And it's creating more of a character out of Stan Lee rather than being just a little self-referential cameo. So I decided not to count it for that reason. I also didn't count the brief appearance in the Deadpool No Good Deed teaser trailer for Deadpool 2, because that whole trailer was very comedy focused anyway, so including Stan Lee in it felt funny. And, you know, it was a good part of the self-referential humour, and having him say, you know, turn around and go, "Zip it, Stan Lee," after Stan compliments him on his costume. It was funny. Unfortunately, though, it means that we got that rather than a cameo in the second Deadpool movie, which is a bit of a shame. And then the final one that I wanted to mention as an honourable mention is his appearance in Season 1, Episode 13 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It was Stan's only appearance in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Basically, the team are on a train, posing as members on a train for this episode. Just members of the public. They're all doing different cover stories. And Agent Simmons is working with Coulson. She has crafted this elaborate cover story, and she starts ranting, expressing this cover story of Coulson being her estranged father. And Stan Lee's character overhears this and, expresses his sympathies for her and then tells Coulson off. And it's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. I really liked that. It was one of... I think for me, Tracks is the episode where Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. really got good and really kind of nailed the formula. I will be doing a episode on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. at some point. And for me, that's definitely the turning point for it almost. And yeah, having a Stan Lee cameo in that episode felt appropriate because of that fact. So yeah, it was a good one. But let's get to the actual list itself. So there's 40 cameos on this list. So number 40, the very first X-Men movie. In the first X-Men movie, I actually didn't notice Stan Lee's cameo until someone pointed it out to me. Stan Lee appears as a hot dog vendor on the beach during the scene where Senator Kelly walks out of the waves. Now, it's very much a background cameo. It's a blink and you miss it. He's not focused on, he's not in frame in a way that he would become in his later cameos. It's very much a blink and you miss it one. And in some respects, this is fitting because this is how a lot of Stan Lee's cameos in the comics are. He usually appears as a hot dog vendor in the back issues, in the pages of Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or something like that. He'll be, just a vendor selling hot dogs in the streets of New York. But, this is very definite. This is the most cameo of them, in that there's no real attention drawn to it. It is a background part. Number 39, I've gone for Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, I actually have a pop vinyl of Stan Lee in this look. This was the one I got because it looked most like the actual Stan Lee. And he's just chatting to a woman and gets accused by Rocket of being a pervert, cheating on his wife. But yeah, it's just, and again, it's a simple cameo. It seems very quick. It seems almost like, we're getting this out the way so we can get on with the rest of the movie. Which some of the other cameos seem to do later on as well, but some of the others have better lines or things that actually make them a bit more memorable, because we can hear Stan speaking, but his dialogue is completely overshadowed by Rocket's narration, which I think ruins it somewhat. Number 38, this is probably my least favourite out of all of them. I think the other two are just forgettable almost, but this one, I don't know, feels... This one and Iron Man 2 both feel a bit more insulting, which is that Stan is not himself. He's mistaken for other people. And in Iron Man 1, he's mistaken for Hugh Hefner. And he's even dressed in a similar way to Hugh Hefner, which I don't understand, unless it is meant to be Stan Lee as Hugh Hefner, which is very weird. Number 37 is Iron Man 2 for a similar reason, where he's mistaken as Larry King. However, I do think that if you were going to mistake Stan Lee for either Hefner or Larry King, he looks a lot more like Larry King than he does Hugh Hefner. But still, it's both of them are just okay. Why? And it's a shame that, you know, Stan Lee's cameos will go on to be such this huge thing, especially in the MCU. And his first two are so just very unimpressive. Yeah. Number 36 is Thor: The Dark World. Not a great movie overall, so not a great cameo, unsurprisingly. He's a mental patient who asks for his shoe back from Selvig, who is using it as a demonstration for physics. It's a bizarre inclusion in a bizarre subplot. I don't think the subplot of Selvig being in a mental institution really works. I don't know what they were trying to do with it. I think it just distracts, and it's one of those many things that leaves Thor: The Dark World feeling very muddled. Like it didn't quite know what it wanted to do with all of the cast that it had returning, which is a shame, because some of the other scenes in that film are very good. Like, a lot of the returning cast on Asgard all get something to do. But the returning human cast, especially Selvig, just seem like afterthoughts. Which is a shame. Number 35 is Iron Man 3. Stan Lee is a pageant judge, very enthusiastically giving a bikini-clad woman a 10. And, yeah, okay, fair enough. He looks very happy and fun with it. Yeah, there's several stories I've read about Stan Lee being a bit of a lech. And not in a Me Too kind of way, just, you know, consent always seems to have been important. Like, I've never heard of any stories of him abusing anyone or anything like that. But yeah, the enthusiastically giving a 10 and everything like that just makes him look a bit like a dirty old man, to be fair. And yeah, it doesn't sit quite right with me. Number 34, I've put Amazing Spider-Man 2. He's just a guest at the graduation who, when Peter arrives, says, "Hey, I think I know that guy." It's just something quick and simple. It's not terrible. It's not too bad. But yeah, it's simple. We're starting to get to the better ones that have a bit more substance to them, I think, or have a bit more of a role in the movie. Number 33, Ang Lee's Hulk, from 2003. This one I quite like, but it's less that I like it because of Stan Lee. Although, for a fun fact, this was his first speaking cameo. All of his cameos up until, well, in a Marvel property anyway, all of his cameos up until then had been silent. So that was X-Men, the first two Spider-Man movies, and I was going to say not X-Men 2, because he didn't actually appear in that. But and Daredevil, which was earlier in 2003. Hulk was his first speaking role, and he's talking to Lou Ferrigno, who's also playing a security guard. And that's why it becomes more memorable to me, is that it's also Lou Ferrigno's cameo as well, because Lou Ferrigno cameos in both of the Hulk movies as well. And so, yeah, it's on its own, it's not terrible, but yeah, it becomes... I think I might have preferred it if they both had separate cameos rather than putting them both together.
But it is what it is. It's like if they'd have put... I mean, Stan Lee appeared in Trial of the Incredible Hulk as well, the TV movie in the 80s, where he was the foreman on the jury. And so, similar sort of cameo to that, maybe. Like, maybe not a foreman in the jury, there's no crime in this, but... No trial, anyway. But, like, having him cameo somewhere else in the film, especially because Hulk is quite a long movie. There's plenty of places you could have had him appear. Number 32, I've gone for Deadpool. Yes, the cameo of Stan Lee in the first Deadpool movie, where he is the MC at the strip club, and announces chastity to the stage. It's a fun cameo. It made me think of the old Stripperella series that he did. I think it was Stripperella. I saw Stan Lee's Stripperella with... I swear the voice artist was Pamela Anderson. And it was a very dumb cartoon. But yeah, apparently came from an idea by Stan Lee. He got sued over it, if I remember rightly. I think a stripper said that she gave him the idea while giving him a lap dance. Although Stan Lee himself actually came out and said, oh, they just CGI'd me in. I wasn't actually there. It could have been a lot more fun. So yeah, again, that's the bit of the lech coming out. But yes, it's fine. It's silly and funny, and there's not many other places I could think you could have included Stan Lee in Deadpool, and having an octogenarian stripper MC is quite funny. So yeah, that made me chuckle when I first saw it. And then 31 is Captain America, the first Avenger. Stan Lee appears as a general when Cap is supposed to be given his medal. And Cap doesn't appear, so someone else comes out. And Stan Lee says, I thought he'd be taller. Obviously mistaking the person who has come out on stage for Stan Lee. And for Captain America, sorry. And yeah, it made me chuckle. It's one of the better early MCU ones, but yeah, not my favourite of the Phase 1. That comes later. So yeah, that's the first 10. Mixed results on them all. Number 30, I have gone for Doctor Strange. The cameo in Doctor Strange is more memorable for what Stan Lee is reading. He is reading a novel called The Doors of Perception, which is one that features the same sort of magic, time-bending things that are going on in the actual the battle around him. Because Stanley is just reading it on a bus when Mordo and Strange crash into the side of the bus, having fallen down the street due to the mirror dimension and everything that's going on around them. And so, yeah, the cameo becomes notable, not for Stan Lee, but what he's reading. So unless you know what he's reading, it's kind of lost on you. And I mean, it's simple enough for what it is, but it's not the best. It's one of the better of this end of cameos, where they are sort of smaller moments. But I think by this point as well, this was 2017, or was it 2016? Might have been 2016. Stan Lee was a bit more well-known. And I don't know, so his cameos were being looked forward to, especially the MCU. And it was nice to always get something where he was actually interacting with the heroes a bit more, or had a bit more to do. So, yeah, it's one of my... It's on the lower end of my MCU cameo list. 29 is X-Men 3, The Last Stand. Stan Lee's cameo appears very early on, and it's after a cameo from someone else as well, which is Chris Claremont. In the opening flashback scene, when the young Jean Grey uses her powers, she levitates things around the neighbourhood. And Chris Claremont first appears as the man whose lawnmower flies away, and then Stan Lee appears as the man with the water hose, and the water starts going up. And he gets a bit more focus on his cameo than Chris Claremont does. You know, we get a zoom into his face for the first time in an X-Men movie, and actually hold the shot on him. It's a good one. It's simple. Yeah, I don't hate it. It's just over with very quickly. But that's the worst I can really say about it. Number 28, I've put Spider-Man 2. The reason Spider-Man 2 is lower is because it's an exact almost an exact recreation of Stan Lee's cameo from Spider-Man 1, which is at position 27. Because both of them just involve Stan Lee saving someone from falling debris while looking up at the battle happening above them. And it's just simple and quick, and blink and you'll miss it. And it's nice that he's involved in what's going on. But doing the same thing twice in the first two movies, yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's more that could be done. Number 26, though, is the first non-Marvel one I'm going to talk about, which is his cameo as the bus driver in Season 1 of Heroes, Episode 16. Now, this is one that... The first time I watched Heroes, I really like Season 1 of Heroes, especially. Season 1, I think, is very, very well done. And it's very clearly a reference and a love letter to a lot of superhero media. But especially, to me, it makes me think of things like X-Men or Inhumans, where it's kind of... these heroes are just randomly appearing. And I think the first season, especially, is a very well-constructed story. And it's anchored by very good characters. And I probably will do an episode on it at some point, because I do think it's worth talking about. Especially how that potential was squandered later on, unfortunately. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about here the cameo. The scene is quite a dour one. You know, one of the main characters is splitting from his friend who has been with him this entire time, and he's leaving him behind to continue his journey alone. And he goes to step on a bus, and the bus driver is played by Stan Lee. And like I said, Heroes was an original property. It was clearly inspired by a lot of comic book work, but it was a completely new property. And the inclusion of Stan Lee feels very deliberate as a result. Like, this was a deliberate plan to bring in Stan Lee purely for this cameo. And that, to me, matters. And to a lot of people, like, they went out of their way to bring in Stan Lee for this cameo. And Heroes is a good show. Like, I really enjoy Heroes. Like I said, especially season 1. But this feels like a nice acknowledgement of who Stan Lee is to the industry, to the medium of superheroes, that they wanted to bring him in for this cameo. So yeah, I like it. And it's one of the better ones, I think, because of the fact it clearly meant something to the writers, the show makers, the directors, that they wanted to put Stan Lee in this role. So yeah, I like that. 25 is Venom. Now, Stan Lee appears towards the end of the first Venom movie, and I'm not a huge fan of the Venom movies anyway. I think they're a bit of a mess. But I do like the cameo. Except for the actual Venom symbiote saying that, his dog looks tasty. Because, yeah, some parts of the humour in Venom really annoy me. But, yeah, the only issue with it is it seems to raise questions. It's like, can Stan Lee hear them? Can he hear Venom inside Eddie's head? Does he know who Eddie is? Venom's reaction of like, who is that guy? Makes a bit more sense, because it's like, Stan Lee clearly seems to know them. So yeah, a bit of a bizarre one, but not a bad one, by any means. 24 is Black Panther. And one of the reasons I like this one, where he's the patron in the casino who steals the chips. One of the many reasons why I like this one is because Stan Lee had been quite vocal about how a lot of his more modern cameos, because he was in quite failing health, he wasn't able to travel as much, and also because these films are getting more expensive, more well thought out, more CGI heavy. A lot of these cameos were being filmed separately. He wasn't on set with the rest of them. He was being filmed usually on green screen and inserted in. Black Panther, however, he's clearly on set with the rest of them. He's interacting with the same set. If he has been inserted in, he's been inserted in very, very well. But no, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that, no, he's actually there. And it's you see him in the same shot as Martin Freeman, I believe. Whereas, a lot of the other roles, a lot of the other cameos that came around the same time, he's usually shot separately. Because that he was inserted in afterwards. He was filmed separately. And so, yeah, it means a bit more in that respect, I think. 23 is Civil War. Now, this is a good example of one where Stan Lee is shot separately because, his scenes of him are on his own. But, yeah, he appears as the FedEx driver towards the end. And it's a good one because he appears very late in the film. Most of the main storytelling is over by this point. And, Stan Lee appears as this FedEx driver delivering a parcel to Tony Stank. And I think it's Rhodey's reaction to that makes it for me, because he's even though he's not in frame with them, Stan Lee is directly interacting with the Avengers, and they're actively responding to something he said, which makes it more memorable to me. And the Tony Stank thing became one of the more memorable lines from that film, one of the more memorable jokes from that film, because Captain America Civil War is a bit more dour than a lot of the other Marvel fare. There is some humour in it, but it's a lot more serious and a lot less obviously jokey than most of the other Marvel properties. Not that I think Marvel properties are all jokes all the time. They're not, quite clearly. Anyone who thinks that is objectively wrong. They are no more jokey than most other action films, but Captain America Civil War is definitely more dour. So, yes. It's one of the better ones, I think. 22, I've put Avengers Endgame. Now, I ummed and ahed about this one when I was looking through the list, because I do think it's one of the least memorable. You know, Stan Lee, de-aged, driving past Camp Lehigh, saying, "Make love, not war," as a hippie. And I think for Stan Lee's final cameo, due to his death, his final cameo in the MCU, it's really not much of anything. But it grew on me. Because after Stan Lee passed away, Marvel Comics at the time started putting some of Stan Lee's old soapboxes back in modern issues. And I've been reading through a lot of the X-Men books from that period. You know, I'm reading them through on Marvel Unlimited, and the soapboxes are still there. And, you know, usually when the comic goes on Marvel Unlimited, anything that was in the print version, so like letter pages, advert pages, you know, anything like that that would sort of reference the rest of Marvel Comics is cut out, and you just get the story. The soapboxes are the exception. And for me, I'm really glad they're still there. I actually am. I'm really glad they're still there. Because a lot of the old... Like, Stan had stopped writing the soapboxes by the time I started reading regular comics. But they are very much very clear expressions of maybe not who the man himself was, but definitely the image that he wanted to portray. And whatever else you could say about Stan Lee is a storyteller. He knows what's important. He knows what's valuable. And the soapboxes show that. The soapboxes show the image that he wanted to portray, what he felt was important, what he felt was valuable to impart to his fans, to his readers. And so much of the message on those soapboxes is about goodness and hope and love and compassion for people and, you know, avoiding hate. You know, some of Stan Lee's most famous quotes are about that. You know, one of his final speeches, which went viral, a little video that he made, where he says about Marvel Comics always being the world outside your window, and how, you know, that man out over there is your brother, that woman over there, that's your sister. And it may be, like, the cynical among people could clearly say, oh, it was designed, that's what he was doing, he was a storyteller. yeah, even if that's the case, I don't care because the message is something I can believe in and something I can support regardless. Like, I believe in that message. I believe in that message of togetherness and compassion. And so having that final cameo be something that is as simple as make love, not war, that cuts through to quite a lot of who Stan Lee was. And that makes it more important, I think. Plus, the actress who's on frame with him, they've edited her to make her look like how Joan appeared in that time period as well. So it looks like Stan and Joan driving together, which is lovely. You know, that's quite nice. So yeah, I like that as well. So yeah, this is a cameo that I've definitely changed my mind on over time. You know, obviously it came out after his death, and it was one that I think everyone was expecting something amazing for his final cameo. And it's not. It's quite simple. But at the same time, it being quite simple is lovely. So, yeah. And then 21. And I like this one just because it makes me laugh. And that's Ant-Man. And it makes me laugh because it's part of Lewis's story. Stan Lee appears as the barman in Lewis's story, speaking with his dialogue dubbed over by Lewis, describing someone as crazy, stupid, fine. Lewis is a great character in the Ant-Man movies. I've heard he's not in the new one, which is a huge shame if it's true. Because he's definitely one of the best things about the first two, and his stories are incredible. So, yeah, having Stan Lee appear in those stories, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Love it. And yeah, it was a good one for being different to anything we'd seen before. So, yeah, I do like that one. Right, so now we're on to the top 20. Number 20, Thor Ragnarok. I really like Thor Ragnarok in a lot of ways anyway. But yeah, having Stan Lee as the hairdresser on Sakaar makes me chuckle. Because, again, it's deliberately interacting, deliberately interacting is the wrong word. Very definitely interacting with Thor. Like, he cuts Thor's hair, and Thor pleading with him not to have his hair cut makes me chuckle. And also his costume design, everything about Sakaar, I really like, because it just looks like a Jack Kirby fever dream. It's so much of it is these very Jack Kirby designs lifted from the page. And, everything's bright and colourful and bizarre. And it's one of the things I love so much about Thor Ragnarok. Especially when you contrast it to something else which featured a lot of Jack Kirby designs, but brutalised them, as far as I can tell, which is the Zack Snyder Justice League. Zack Snyder's Justice League features a lot of the Fourth World mythos, the Apocalypse characters. So, Steppenwolf, Darkseid, Desard, Granny Goodness in a brief cameo right towards the end, with the Female Furies, the Parademons. None of them look anything like the bizarre things that Jack Kirby created. They're grey and grimy and boring. Meanwhile, Thor Ragnarok and Doctor Strange look like the sort of things that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko would have drawn back in the day, in the early 60s, 4-color Marvel comics. And they've been lifted direct from the page, and it's glorious and beautiful, and I love it. And it's one of many reasons why Marvel is better at this than DC are, because DC, in a similar way to how Fox and Sony have been before them, seems so ashamed of the comics and just being crazy and silly with it. There are exceptions, like James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, which has Starro the Conqueror and is incredible because it is just crazy third act weirdness where they fight a giant starfish. That's the sort of stuff that all of these comic book movies should have been doing since the first Avengers. You know, that minute that the first Avengers descends into the Battle of New York and it's just that third act comic book spectacle, that is what every comic book film should have been doing. And so many of them haven't been. And so this is why Ragnarok is great, but this is also why Stan Lee's cameo is great. He has this ridiculous sci-fi gadget thing to cut hair. He has this ridiculous brightly coloured costume. And it all just fits really well. And yeah, it makes me laugh. Speaking of, number 19, Avengers Assemble, as it is called over here in the UK. Stan Lee appears in the ending montage playing chess in the park and turns around and says on the news report, "Superheroes in New York, give me a break." Love that line. Very clearly a reference to the fact that all of the Marvel heroes are based in New York in the comics. But also just a very funny line. The only issue I have with it is while I do like the line and I love Stan Lee's delivery of that line, I do think the deleted scene line was better. For those who aren't aware, there is a deleted scene for the first Avengers film where Stan Lee appears in this deleted scene. The deleted scene features Captain America going to the restaurant where the waitress who appears in the third act works. And I think he buys a coffee or a cake or something from her. And, you know, she flirts with him a little bit because it's Chris Evans playing Steve Rogers, you know, who isn't going to flirt with him a little bit. And Stan is, Steve is completely oblivious to this. And sort of says something nice and she walks off. And as she walks off, Stan Lee leans in from behind him and says, "Ask for a number, you moron." And I like this because it's kind of showing the generation gap that Steve is going through, where the world has just changed so drastically. There's a lot more... People are more direct now than perhaps they were in the 40s. In a lot of ways. You know, if you're interested in someone, you do just ask for their number. But again, it's interacting with a character. It's Stan Lee leaning in and interacting with Cap. And I like that. You know, I do like the scene that's in the actual film. Don't get me wrong. I really do. I like it. It's a great line and it's delivered superbly. But I think it would have been good if we'd had both. But I think if I could have only picked one, I would probably have kept the deleted scene in. But that's a discussion for another day. Number 18, Avengers Infinity War. Stan Lee as the jaded bus driver right at the start of the film who says, "Haven't you ever seen a spaceship before?" Genius. It's just, it's pure and it's simple and it's just genius. A clear reference to the fact that in the Marvel universe, in the MCU especially, you've had this alien invasion of New York. So, you know, this sort of jaded bus driver, and saying it to a whole load of kids who are getting all hyperactive and panicky because Ned's distracting them. It's brilliant. It plays into the scene that's ongoing. Although it also does feel like, okay, we're getting this out of the way now, you know, because this is early on in the film. And it does feel like, yes, we're getting this cameo out of the way because we have far more important stuff to do. Which is fair for Infinity War. Because Infinity War is a very big, very involved, and, you know, very heavy in places film. And so having, you know, the comedy and the quick stuff out of the way first makes sense. So yeah, I don't hate it. And I think it's a good way of including Stan Lee in this, because I don't think there was many other places they could have put him in the film. Because there's just not many other characters besides our main heroes for most of this runtime. 17. Spider-Man 3. Now again, this is another one that I have thought long and hard about since originally watching it. When I originally watched it, I was not a fan of this cameo. Stan Lee is a man in Times Square who, while Peter Parker is watching Spider-Man on the big New York Jumbotron, leans in and says to Peter, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, you know, I think one man can make a difference. Enough said, and then walks off. And on one hand, I really like the delivery of "Nuff said" and just the casual line delivery. It fits. The issue that I had with it when I first watched it, and it's something that still irks me a bit about Spider-Man 3, is the idea that that Spider-Man is so beloved. Because that's not the case. Like, even in Spider-Man comics, even when he's been an Avenger, Spider-Man is not liked. He never really has been. He's not a beloved character. And so having that feels weird, almost. And I don't get why they've done that. Why they've done the big, huge Jumbotron. I mean, on one hand, it makes sense as sort of like a world building thing. Like, yeah, New York, home of Spider-Man. Come see New York. And obviously, Spider-Man does save people, so some people will be on Spider-Man's side. But like, the point of the comics is he's not trusted. He doesn't wear a mask. You know, he wears a mask, so people don't trust him, despite the whole friendly neighborhood aspect. There's a lot of people that do not like Spider-Man. And things like the Daily Bugle do not help that, you know. And the Daily Bugle is a very prominent part of those Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. You know, and the whole thing on people turning against Spider-Man is like an undercurrent message throughout all three of those films. But at the same time, purely from the perspective of the cameo itself, I don't hate the cameo. You know, it's Stan Lee quite simply just saying, you know, one man can make a difference, which was the whole point of Spider-Man in the comics when he created him, or as he alleges he created him. And You know, getting to say his classic delivery of "Nuff said," one of his big catchphrases that I don't think he says in any of his other cameos. Yeah, that does raise it up a bit. I have to say, it does raise it up a bit. And so, yeah, this is one I've mellowed on as I've gotten older. I still have issues with it, but in terms of the actual cameo itself, how the cameo is presented, you know, he's interacting with Peter Parker. He says a nice line. He gets to deliver one of his famous catchphrases. Yeah, I can't hate it that much as a result. And finally, number 16 for this bit. Number 16 is Incredible Hulk. Now, I like the cameo in Incredible Hulk because Stan Lee is a part of the plot. Stan Lee drinks some soda that has been contaminated with some of Hulk's blood. And he gets ill from it. Like, he drinks it, then says, wow, and then drops the bottle. The bottle explodes. And we reveal that he got gamma sickness. But they were able to... the army was able to use his condition to track the bottle to the bottling plant to work out where the Hulk was. To work out where Bruce Banner is. Which means that Stan Lee, in this cameo, has a role in the plot. And that, to me, made it really good. Really good. Like, it's not just a throwaway cameo. He's a part of the plot. And that makes it one of my favourite MCU cameos. Because it's important. You know, it feels like it matters. So yeah, that's one of the better ones, I think. 15, Captain Marvel. Now, Captain Marvel was the first MCU film to release after Stan Lee's death. And so the most obvious change is the Stan Lee tribute at the start, where the traditional Marvel Studios opening, or at least the Marvel Studios opening they've had since, I think Doctor Strange, is it the first film that uses it? You know, where we see the flick of the comic book pages through to the script, through to the concept art, all the way through to actual clips from the films as it pans around the Marvel Studios logo. That was all replaced with things relating to Stan Lee. And it's not the only time that happened as well. They did a similar tribute for Chadwick Boseman, which they had on the Disney Plus version of Black Panther for a while, and then later launched as the opening for Wakanda Forever. And I like it. I really do. I really like it. It was powerful, just seeing all these shots of Stan Lee in the MCU, but not just in the MCU, like in the comics as well, interacting with fans, interacting with the actors, the directors, the screenwriters, and then just ending it with a simple message that just said, "Thank you, Stan." You know, I like that. It was good. And then the actual cameo itself in the film, you know, he's on the train. He's on the train when Captain Marvel breaks in looking for the Skrull. And, well, Captain Marvel, Vers, as she's called at this point in the movie. And he's reading a script and the script is Mallrats, which he appears in later on that year, because it was set in 1995. He doesn't look like how he did in Mallrats, though. In Mallrats, he has a fuller beard, whereas it's Stan Lee appearing more as he is now. And he smiles at Carol, who then smiles back. But he's also saying one of his famous lines. He's saying, "Face front, true believer." Which is... yeah, it's nice. It's a reference to, one of his first major cameos. It's a reference to the era. It's a reference to one of his major lines. And it's just a nice, touching tribute. He smiles at Veers, and Veers smiles back at him. It's nice. I like it. Number 14, Thor. Stan Lee someone ties a chain around Mjolnir, which is buried in the desert, and the truck lurches forward, and the tail bar rips off. In fact, I think most of the back half of the truck rips off. And Stan Lee leans out the window and says, "Did it work?" Just nice and simple. But it made me laugh. And it made me laugh quite a bit. And it's vaguely plot relevant as well. It made me chuckle, and so this is one that is up there for me as a result. Number 13, X-Men Apocalypse. Now, X-Men Apocalypse is not a great movie. It's a movie that has some great scenes in it, but in itself is not a great movie. And this is one of the better scenes. Apocalypse at one point launches every nuclear weapon in the world and destroys them all. And Stan Lee and his wife Joan are out on the patio, and they watch the nuclear launch. And Stan hugs her close to protect her, while looking in fear at the rockets going off into the sky. And it's dark. It's very dark, very bleak compared to a lot of his other cameos. But Stan Lee once described this one as his favourite cameo to do. Previously, before this, his favourite had been one that I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is Age of Ultron. But he said this one became his favourite. And the reason it became his favourite was because Joan was there. His real-life wife. Joan and Stan were married for 70 years before she passed away. She passed away in 2017, so not long after Apocalypse actually came out. And... she'd been with Stan Lee a long time, and she had been credited by him as the inspiration for a lot of his work. Like, she was the one that told him to write Fantastic Four, which, the comic that kick-started the Marvel Universe. Every time he had an idea, he would run it past her, and she would give her honest feedback. And Stan would do whatever he wanted to with it, but always sort of take it on board. Stan Lee credited her as being not just the inspiration for the Fantastic Four, where, he basically said he wanted to do a comic that was very, very different. And he was confident he was going to leave comics at this point. And she said, well, just do it. If it doesn't work and they fire you anyway, you already want to leave. What have you got to lose? Just do it. And Fantastic Four went on to be, like I said, the foundational comic for the Marvel Universe. You know? He also said that she was the deliberate inspiration behind Gwen Stacy, which is one of the reasons why Stan Lee was so upset when Gwen Stacy died in the comics. You know, why he wanted Peter and Gwen to get together. But yeah, yeah, having Joan in this cameo with him was obviously something that meant a lot to Stan Lee, because his relationship with Joan was so important to him. And, you know, Joan herself had been part of the Marvel Universe as well. Like, she voiced Madam Web in the 90s Spider-Man series. You know, she'd done many things with Stan, many gigs, documentaries, all sorts of things. She was involved in this as well. But this was I think the only time they actually had a cameo together, and it's clear that meant a lot to Stan Lee. So, yeah. It's good, and I like it. Number 12, Avengers Age of Ultron, which Stan Lee used to describe as his favourite cameo before working with Joan. This is a more extended cameo. There's a couple of lines. But the reason that it's important to me is Stan mentions fighting at Omaha Beach. Stan didn't fight at Omaha Beach, but he did work with the army. He was actually part of a propaganda unit for the army, like an actual writing unit, along with Dr. Seuss, I believe. So yeah, Stan Lee and Dr. Seuss were part of the same unit in World War II. And, you know, their role was using their skills to, you know, help win the war. And it worked. But in this, he gets to directly interact with Cap and Thor. And he gets drunk on Asgardian ale. And is carried off saying, Excelsior, very drunkenly. And, yeah, for me, that makes it one of the perfect cameos. Just the reference, the interaction with the characters, multiple lines. Like I said, Stan's a decent actor. He's got decent line delivery. He never feels, his line delivery never feels forced. It's always very natural. He's very comfortable with speaking and public speaking, and it shows. And as a result, this is one of his more fun cameos. I like it. And yeah, using one of his catchphrases again. Number 11, Spider-Man Homecoming. He is the nosy neighbour. The nosy neighbour who leans out of a window and says, "Don't make me come down there, you punk." And I love it. Apart from the fact he's not interacting directly with Spider-Man because he's shot separately. But he is. He's interacting with Spider-Man and then interacts with one of the other neighbours in a very jovial New York way that just feels natural. And I like it. I think it's a lot of fun and I quite like it. It's silly and funny. So yeah, I enjoy that one. So, top 10. And number 10 is one that may be surprising to a lot of people. And that's the 2003 version of Daredevil. Now, in Daredevil, Stan Lee's cameo is almost a blink and you'll miss it one. He appears as part of the extended flashback showing young Matt and how he gets his powers and develops them. Which is not the best way of telling the story. Like, Daredevil was... The 2003 Daredevil movie is not great. I think the director's cut is a lot better. But the film still has problems. And one of the biggest problems is this huge extended flashback right at the start. And like I said, Stan Lee's cameo appears in that, and he's walking down the street reading the paper, and he's about to step off the curb into the traffic when young Matt uses his cane to stop him by hitting his legs. So Stan stops and lowers the paper, which is when we see Stan Lee's face and we see the cars rush past, and then he looks and sees that it's a young blind kid that has stopped him. Now, again, while I do like that fact of it being a direct interaction between the character and Stan Lee, the thing I also like is that Matt saves him. Because in the comics, Matt gets his powers by saving someone. The accident that blinds him, the same accident that gives him his powers, happens because he saves someone. He pushes them out of the way of traffic. That doesn't happen in the 2003 movie. That's not how he gets his powers. Because, you know, he gets his powers trying to find his father and running away from him after seeing his father beating someone working for the mob. He ends up getting caught by some spilled biological waste, almost causing an accident at a construction site. In fact, if anything, the Marvel Daredevil show is much more accurate in terms of showing his injury, because, you know, he saves someone from a truck. Like, someone actually... And the truck is carrying the biological waste that transforms him. And that's what actually should happen. In fact, it probably would have been better if the Marvel Daredevil series had used Stan Lee for that role. I would have loved it if they did. But yeah, the idea of Matt saving someone is so important to his character that, you know, in the comics, that's how he gets his powers. He damns the consequences because saving someone's life is more important. And that's... While the use of it in Daredevil 2003 is a much more low-key version of that, it is still an element of that. You know, as Matt stops Stan Lee walking into traffic. And it's almost like it's a meta-reference to the scene in the comics, the origin story in the comics, while also being something new and different. So yeah, I like that. That's my number 10 slot. Number 9 is Mallrats. Now, I really like Mallrats anyway. The movies of Kevin Smith, I think, are a bit hit and miss. Some of his humour I really like, some of it I do not. Some of it I think has aged a lot better than others. But Mallrats and Dogma, to me, are the two best movies that he's done. I know his favourite is Clerks, and those are the characters he really seems to care about, hence why we've had Clerks 2 and Clerks 3. I'm not as sold on Clerks. I get what people say about it, but it's not my favourite. My favourite is Mallrats. I like the characters in Mallrats. I like a lot of the concepts in Mallrats. It very much feels like a coming-of-age movie that sort of speaks to not necessarily my generation, because it was slightly older, but I watched it when I was the right age to watch it, and I think a lot of it still holds up quite well. And Stan Lee's cameo, it's a more extended cameo, admittedly. He almost takes a supporting role in the film, but it's good. I like it. It's a lot of fun. It acknowledges who Stan Lee is, why he is so important, but also it's just sweet. Yes, they're the obligatory questions that you would get from a teenage boy asking about superhero genitalia. Does the Thing have a giant rock? For example, it's great and silly, and that's the sort of question that I'd imagine Stan Lee has been asked several times. But the point of that is not any of that. The point of that is to show Stan Lee is discussing with Brody, the main character, and giving him advice on love. Because Brody is in the prospect of potentially losing his girlfriend. And it inspires the third act of the film, where Brody attempts to win her back in the most dramatic way possible. And it's all done because of this quite nice discussion that Stan Lee has about love and about couples in love and why love is important. So yeah, I like it. It's very sweet. And for me, it's definitely one of the highlights of the film. I do like Mallrats in general anyway. I think it's a very good film. But Stan Lee's cameo is definitely one of the highlights, and definitely something that I think elevates it a bit more. And Stan Lee and Kevin Smith were apparently really good friends. Like, Kevin Smith, before Stan Lee passed, actually offered, wanted to bring him in and said, come and live with me. When there were accusations of Stan Lee suffering elder abuse. He tried to reach out and look after his friend. And to the point that Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back was supposed to feature Stan Lee towards the end of the film. And, his passing meant that they had to rewrite the film because they couldn't do what they'd planned to do. And it's a shame, and I completely get it. I completely understand. That connection between them, because it feels, they clearly worked on this. Kevin Smith has obviously worked in comics. He's a big fan of comics, and so obviously knows who Stan Lee is and had that respect for the man, and so wanted to use him in his film and in such a prominent role for his film. A lot of the Kevin Smith, the View Askew films especially, tend to have like this one character that will impart sage advice. And in most of the films, it's Kevin Smith himself. It's his character of Silent Bob, who will have a big dramatic line or speech or something that is important to the main characters. It's his character that has that line in the first Clerks, where he gets Dante to reevaluate his relationship. It's his character who tells the Chasing Amy story in Chasing Amy. It's his character who solves the issue in the original Jay and Silent Bob film. But in Mallrats, it's Stan Lee. It's not Silent Bob. It's Stan Lee who says that. Stan Lee who has that role in the narrative. And I think it works. I think it works really well. And I think Stan Lee does it well. He delivers the lines really well. He doesn't feel like, he feels like someone telling a story, being a natural part of the action. He's an actor. He's not just someone awkwardly delivering cameo lines. So yeah, it works for me. Number 8, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Stan Lee plays an astronaut who is an agent of the Watchers. Now, there had been a fan theory going around for a while that in the MCU it would turn out that Stan Lee was actually playing the Watcher. And this fan theory seemed to originate purely because Stan Lee was in every film and seemed to be part of the narrative in every film. And this is kind of building on that by having him be an agent of the Watchers. Although they're not explicitly called the Watchers in this, but they are very clearly the Watchers from the comics. Although, as we now have Jeffrey Wright in What If, the Watcher, well, Uatu the Watcher anyway, has clearly evolved and changed into something different in the MCU. But yes, Stan Lee is an agent of the Watchers, and he's telling them a story. And the story references one of his other cameos. Specifically, it references a cameo from Civil War, which should be impossible, because while Civil War was one of the more recent Marvel movies, it actually creates a continuity error, because Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is set only a few months after Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. Meaning that, he's referencing an event that shouldn't have happened yet. And this is something that James Gunn has actually admitted was a mistake. He had Stan Lee and had him recount like 4 or 5 different ones, and the FedEx one was the one they decided to use. But he did admit that obviously creates a problem. Now, there's plenty of ways you could headcanon your way around that. But for me, it's just funny. I like the fact that there's a mistake left in. Because obviously the way of headcanoning a mistake and being able to explain it within the narrative of the universe is also something that's been part of comics for decades. In fact, I think it was something that Stan Lee originally created, which is when people would write into the original letter pages in the comics and say, oh, I saw this mistake, but here's how it's not a mistake. Here's my theory as to why it's not a mistake. And Stan the Man would give them a coveted Marvel No Prize. And so that has been a thing in the comics for years. The whole idea of the No Prize, of the story, the mistake having an in-universe explanation, and it's up to you to explain it. And if you explain it, you get a Marvel No Prize. And so, you could explain this by saying that, I don't know, he says he was working as a Federal Express delivery driver. He doesn't reference Iron Man. He doesn't reference Captain America. He just says he was working as a Federal Express delivery driver. What if Stan Lee, as the Watcher agent, worked as a Federal Express delivery driver previously in the past. Maybe he gave, an important package to Iron Man earlier on, or, delivered something to Nick Fury or Ant-Man. We don't know the details. But we don't need to know the details. Or maybe he is referring to the events of Civil War, and what actually happened is when he went into space, he ended up time-travelling backwards. Maybe he got caught in a wormhole or some other relativistic thing, which then meant he arrived in 2014, so he was telling this story to the Watchers before they even knew him. And maybe that's also why, when he returns in the post-credit sequence, because Guardians 2 has 5 post-credit sequences, one of which features Stan Lee still on this planet, as the Watchers walk away and leave him. And he says, "Oh, but you're my ride home. How am I going to get back?" Oh, Very funny. It's very, very funny and silly. And I think bringing the joke back in the post-credit sequence, stroke of genius. The fact that it references a big popular fan theory, absolute genius. I'm a big fan of it. It's silly and I like it. Number 7, Amazing Spider-Man. Now, this is one that I've seen is very divisive. A lot of people seem to hate this cameo. Me, I love it. Stan Lee in this one, Lizard and Spider-Man are fighting their way through Midtown High, and they crash through into the library. And in the library, we are on the perspective of Stan Lee, who is, well, we see it from the perspective of Stan Lee, who is wearing headphones, playing very loud classical music while he tidies up. And, he does a bit of dancing and gesturing with his hands and then walks off. But in the middle of all this, Lizard and Spider-Man are fighting in the background, trashing the library. At one point, a table is thrown towards him and caught by a web before it's able to hit him, and yanked back and thrown back at the Lizard. And it's just fun and irreverent, and it's Stan Lee being part of the action while also not being aware of the action, which really makes me chuckle. But yeah, I don't hate it. I really don't hate it. I think it's a lot of fun. And yeah, I know so many people who have complained about it and said, "Oh, it's too obvious." Why can't a cameo be obvious? We know who Stan Lee is. This was several films into not just the MCU, but into the Marvel cinema. Marvel cinema. And, this was the 4th Spider-Man film, for goodness sake. Stan Lee had appeared in every single one. Spider-Man is one of the characters he's most closely linked to. It was obvious he was going to appear at some point. So why not have it be something obvious? Why not just have it be something fun? And that's exactly what it is. It's something fun that makes me chuckle. And that's why I like it. And that's why it's number 7. Number 6, Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer. This is quite possibly one of my favourite Stan Lee cameos ever, because it is directly referencing something from the comics. And it's directly referencing a cameo that Stan Lee had in the comics. As I said, Stan Lee does cameo in the comics. A lot of writers and artists have, use Stan Lee, not just in Marvel Comics, but in DC and Image as well. You know, Stan Lee is someone who's quite beloved in the industry. He's like Jack Kirby. You know, he appears in comics quite a lot. Because people want to make reference to, people want to pay respect to him. But Stan and Jack also used to cameo themselves as well sometimes. And in Fantastic Four Annual number 3, I believe it is, Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Girl get married. And their wedding features pretty much every character who had appeared in Marvel at that point. Both hero and villain appears in this wedding issue. And towards the end of the issue, Stan and Jack themselves try to attend the wedding. And I don't think we ever see their faces, but it's very clear that's who they are. And, you know, they are drawn to look like them. They are written to look like them. I think they even refer to each other by their first names. And they get kicked out because they're not on the guest list. And they wander off saying, don't they even know who we are? You know, no respect. And Rise of the Silver Surfer references that wedding. You know, the wedding of Reed and Sue is a plot point in the movie. And they try to have this wedding early on in New York, and it gets interrupted by the Silver Surfer. The Silver Surfer, by the way, is also... I think Stan Lee once described the Silver Surfer as being his favourite character. You know, the favourite character he created. And I know he wrote the Silver Surfer for a while. Like, he came back and wrote new Silver Surfer stories quite a lot. And I know he's probably more famous for his work with Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four. You know, he wrote... You know, him and Jack Kirby together wrote something like 102 issues of the Fantastic Four before one of them left. And he wrote Spider-Man for a very long time. In fact, if you count the titles that he would continue to write for the newspaper, where Spider-Man used to get a comic strip, he wrote Spider-Man more than he's written any other character. But I know I've definitely heard Stan Lee refer to Silver Surfer as his favourite character. And so the film that introduces the Silver Surfer and that features Reed and Sue's wedding features Stan Lee in almost a direct reference to the wedding issue in the comic, because he tries to attend the wedding. And someone asks him, what's your name? And he says, Stan Lee. And he says, you're not on the list, you have to leave. And he says, but I'm Stan Lee. You know? And, yeah, it makes me chuckle. And it's good because it is that direct reference to the comic book cameo as well. And were Jack King Kirby still alive, you know he'd be there as well. So yeah, I really like that one. The Tim Story Fantastic Four movies, they're not perfect. They have a lot of faults. But the Stan Lee cameos are definite high points. Like, there's a lot of things they get wrong, but there are a lot of things they get right. And their use of Stan Lee in both movies is something they definitely got right. Number 5... Fantastic Four. Now, I said that they got their use of Stan Lee right, and I'm going to echo that with this one. And that is because this one is Stan Lee playing Willie Lumpkin. Willie Lumpkin is the Fantastic Four's mailman. So it is a character created by Stan Lee. So Stan Lee is actually playing one of his own characters in this. And it's a very small role. He appears in one scene when they come back to the Baxter building, and he hands Reed his mail. And he's referenced by name. Like, Reed says, "Thank you, Willie." And there you go. But yeah, Willie Lumpkin is a great recurring character in the comics. He has been the Fantastic Four's mailman for a long, long time. I've seen the character of Willie Lumpkin cameo in so many stories and events because he's just there working and being a mailman. And I think this was a great way to include Stan Lee, and having him play one of his own characters must have been special. And it's great to see. Like, there was talk at one point of doing a live-action Spider-Man film in the 90s, or perhaps even earlier than the 90s, and having Stan Lee play J. Jonah Jameson, which would also have been brilliant. Although I don't think he's acerbic enough to play J. Jonah Jameson. But Willie freaking Lumpkin, you know, this very nice, quiet, jovial mailman. You know, your friendly local mailman. That's a perfect role for Stan Lee to play. And he plays it brilliantly. And it's just a simple line. But the fact that it's Stan Lee playing one of his own characters, to me, that's special. And that's good. And I like that. Number 4, Captain America and the Winter Soldier. Stan Lee plays a guard in the Smithsonian. And it's a nice quick one. Cap mentions something about getting a uniform. You know, he's been wearing this S.H.I.E.L.D. uniform for much of the movie. And obviously he's going to fight S.H.I.E.L.D. And so he goes and steals back from the Smithsonian his original World War II uniform. And Stan Lee plays the guard who finds that the uniform has been stolen with the line, "I am so fired." And again, I love it. It's so simple, but to me, what makes this one is Stan's delivery. Stan Lee's delivery of the line is funny. It's funny. And it's, I don't know, the fact that it's a plot relevant scene, the fact that Stan Lee is used to show it, yeah, something about it just fits for me and just feels right. So yeah, I was very, very happy with this. Very happy. And so yeah, it's one of my favourite. One of my favourites, and definitely one of his best cameos in the MCU. In fact, there's only one other MCU cameo above this one. And like I said, it's not because it's overtly meaningful or overtly funny. It's just simple and yeah, it's just memorable to me. You know, when I think of Stan Lee's cameos, this is usually the one I think of first. For the MCU especially. It's just memorable. It's a good cameo from a good movie. Number 3, Ant-Man and the Wasp. The final MCU cameo I want to talk about. This one for me is my favourite of the MCU cameos. And it's purely
less about the line delivery itself, although that is good, but more what the line is and what that represents. Because the cameo happens during the final chase scene in San Francisco, and you know, the little discs are being thrown around that are growing and shrinking things, and one of them hits Stan Lee's car just as he's about to put his key in the door to open it, and the car shrinks in front of him. And Stan Lee says, well, the 60s were great, but I'm paying for it now, or some variation on that. And that line absolutely floored me the first time I heard it. And it still does. It's still a great line, because the thing that makes it memorable to me is not just that it's referring to, like, drug addiction and imbibing of mind-enhancing substances in the 60s, and how the effect that can have on you in old age. Because I'm sure Stan Lee was involved in some drugs at some point. The dude was living like a rock star for a while there. Between the 60s and the 70s, Stan Lee was huge. And so, him living a bit of a, not a playboy lifestyle, the dude was still happily married. But, definitely some aspect of it, I suppose, because, he still visited strip clubs at some point because he got on the idea for Stripperella. So, hell, for all I know, Joan bought him for him. They could have had that kind of relationship. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. It's not necessarily that makes it work for me. It's the meta level of it. The 60s were fun, but I'm paying for it now. Because here we have Stan Lee, the writer who created so many of these characters in the 60s. Spider-Man, Thor, Ant-Man, the Wasp, Daredevil, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four. He created them in the 60s, and then here he is cameoing in these movies where a lot of the time, just like this one in Ant-Man and the Wasp, not so great things are happening to him. He's getting drunk on Asgardian ale. He's drinking contaminated, gamma-contaminated soda. He's losing his job because one of the exhibits at the Smithsonian got stolen from under him. Or he's having his car shrunk. If you take it just from the perspective of, not necessarily the Watcher theory, but the idea that all of these Stan Lee cameos are connected, they're all happening to the same person in the MCU. Yeah, he's definitely paying for the 60s. And, even looking at it from the perspective of, the meta level, where it's like, he's created these characters and now he's paying for it by having to do all these cameos. It just works for me really well. It's a really fun line that just makes me chuckle. And yeah, I like it. I'm a big fan of this line. I'm a big fan of the delivery. Yeah, it's a good one. The 60s were fun, but I'm paying for it now. Yes. Yes, indeed, Stanley. Yes, indeed, you are. Number 2, Teen Titans Go to the Movies. Teen Titans Go is, again, another maligned property. It's a very kid-focused reboot of the Teen Titans show from the mid-2000s. And the Teen Titans cartoon show was very, very good. Like, very good. And had a lot of drama to it and a lot of pathos to it. And could still be very, very silly and irreverent at times. Like, there's plenty of episodes that are very irreverent. But on the whole, the series was more serious. Teen Titans Go isn't. Teen Titans Go is very jokey, very jovial, very irreverent. It feels like a cartoon show. And most especially a cartoon show aimed towards children. That's not a bad thing at all. I've watched a lot of Teen Titans Go. My kids like it. I think it's very good. There's a lot of very funny moments in it, if you just take it for what it is. And Teen Titans Go to the movies, especially, is a very good film with a lot of great self-referential meta-commentary on movie making, especially superhero movie making, and especially the state of the DC movies, but also a lot of commentary on the MCU as well. And Stan Lee has a cameo appearance. In fact, he has two. He has two cameos in the same movie. And his cameos are funny. His first one appears with him, you know, as after the Teen Titans have broken onto the studio lot, and Stan Lee appears in the background sweeping the floor with gurning for the camera, like a proper big smile for the camera, like, hey, notice me. And then just as the Teen Titans go to walk off, he runs forward, grabs the camera, and says, hey, it's me, Stan Lee, here for my subtle cameo. And then you get loads of logos and posing of him as Stan. And then someone whispers into his ear and says, you know, this is a DC movie. And he's like, oh no, a DC movie, I'm in the wrong place, I've got to get out of here. And he exits stage left. But that's funny enough on its own, because it's, you know, the subtle cameo as he grabs the camera and jumps in your face. You know, that in itself is very funny. But then the fact they follow that up with him appearing later on when the Teen Titans are trying to escape, and he jumps onto the little, like, studio golf cart thing that they're using. And he jumps on the front and he says, I don't even care if it is a DC movie. I just love making cameos, with a big smile. And then they're like, not now, Stan Lee. And they throw him off the cart and he rolls into the ground and just goes, Excelsior! It's so silly and very funny. And again, I think this was another one that was released after he'd passed, but, or if not after he'd passed, not long before he did. But it's just nice. And the thing is, while it's a DC movie, and I don't think Stan Lee ever had any involvement with the Teen Titans themselves, Stan Lee did write for DC. A lot of people might not know that, but he did. He wrote a series of one-shots called Just Imagine If Stan Lee Had Created X DC Character. And they did quite a few of them. I think there was about 13 in total. And I think they're actually coming back to them again, or coming back to those characters. I think there's a new story being planned featuring Stan Lee's versions of those characters. But he did a What If Stan Lee created Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, The Flash, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, Catwoman, I think was one of them, Sandman was another, and then culminating in a Justice League. and it was very much a what if Stan Lee created them, and it was definitely Stan Lee writing, partnered up with a different DC artist each time. And they're a bit hit and miss. They're not great. Your mileage may vary depending on how much you like Stan Lee's writing anyway. I'm not a huge fan of Stan Lee's writing. I think it's very much of its time. It definitely got better. But some of his early 60s stuff I really struggle with. But these are some of his better works. But he's a very wordy writer in some respects. But he also does seem to know how to let the art tell a story. So I'm very glad of that in a lot of respects. But yeah, it was just nice. I think because Teen Titans Go was being very fourth wall breaky and very meta, and having these references to superhero movie making, having Stan Lee cameo made sense, and I think they did it very well. So yeah, I'm glad it was included, and that's why it takes the number 2 spot, because it was good and it was fun, and again, you got the interaction with the characters, you got the amazing line, you know, the classic line of Excelsior. So yeah, a lot of fun. But there's one more that beat it. And finally, number 1, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I've spoken before on this channel about how much I love Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I think it is an incredible film. It is a testament to the quality of the medium of animation and the stories that it is able to tell. And it also tells an amazing and incredible story, firmly centered around a newer character that subverts a lot of what people would expect from a Spider-Man story, and especially a multiverse, a big team-up story. Because, make no mistake, Into the Spider-Verse is Miles' story. You know, it's a film about multiple Spider-Men, you know, but the focus of the story is always on Miles. And Spider-Verse came out after Stan Lee's passing. And Stan Lee had been recorded for the role that he plays in it. He plays the seller of the costume. And so after Peter Parker, Spider-Man, has passed in the universe, and the people are mourning, Miles, along with many others, buys a Spider-Man costume from a costume seller, and that seller is played by Stan Lee. And Stan has several lines in this which undercut a lot of the meaning that he always said was about Spider-Man. And one of the things that he always said was he was most proud of when creating Spider-Man. But also makes reference to his own personal history with the character. Because he says, you know, I knew him, you know. And, you know, Miles says, well, what if the costume doesn't fit? And he says, oh, it always fits, eventually. And there's a brief pan over to a sign that says, no refunds, no exchanges. So, clearly, you know, meant to be almost Stan Lee's character saying, no, it's going to fit because you can't bring it back. But Stan Lee, when he's spoken about Spider-Man, and this is the skill of himself as a storyteller and as a narrator, and how much he is able to influence his own story. You know, he has come out in the past and one of the most quotable lines I think I've ever seen from Stan Lee is, "I've told this story so many times it might even be true." And that is a line that he's used when prefacing his story telling the origin of Spider-Man. Because it may not have been the original story as to why he came up with Spider-Man or how he came up with Spider-Man, but it is the story that Stan Lee is choosing to tell about coming up with this character, which was the idea that Spider-Man could be anyone. And he wanted him to be a teenager. He wanted him to be someone relatable to the audience. And someone that the audience could see themselves being. And he always said one of the things he was proud of, you know, it wasn't necessarily by design, was that Spider-Man's mask covers his whole face. Which means it was possible for any kid to imagine themselves underneath that mask. And obviously Spider-Man, Peter Parker, is a white boy from Queens. But girls could imagine themselves being Spider-Man. You know, black kids, Latin kids, Asian kids could imagine themselves being Spider-Man. Because that mask covered their face. They could be Spider-Man. And that is one of the core themes of Spider-Verse itself. The idea that anyone can be Spider-Man, that anyone can be a hero. That is the point of Miles' whole story. And the idea that the costume will fit. You know, it always fits eventually. Because Miles and Gwen and all of the other heroes in this film can be Spider-Man. Because Spider-Man can be anyone. And I love it. It's a good message that feels thematic to the film itself, but also to the history of the character and the often quoted design for the character from Stan Lee himself. And makes it something worth saying, worth telling, worth being described in the film. So yeah, that in itself is lovely. And of course, Stan saying, you know, I'm going to miss him. We were friends, you know. Because in the real world, we still have Spider-Man. We still have the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, Daredevil, Thor, Ant-Man, all the characters that Stan Lee created. And what we don't have is Stan Lee. And the idea that were those characters aware of him, they would miss him. That's their creator. He will be missed. You know, he is missed. Stan Lee is missed. Like, people miss going to the Marvel films and seeing Stan Lee's cameos. And you know, it's sad. And death is inevitable, I know that. And Stan Lee was a very old man when he passed. But it's still sad. It's still a shame that he passed away. You know, it's a shame when anyone passes away. You know, I don't like death. I'm not a fan of it. And despite some of the media, you know, that I consume and the discussion of what makes a good death for a character, In the real world, there's no such thing as a good death. A lot of people just die. They just reach the end of their life and die. And within a few generations, most of us will be forgotten. But then you do get some people that leave a legacy, leave something behind that people will miss. And that's what I think Stan Lee did. He left behind a legacy that we will miss. A legacy of heroes, of great characters that we can remember him by. And Spider-Verse ends with a tribute to Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, both of whom died in the same year, and both of whom created Spider-Man. And obviously Stan gets more reference in the film. He physically appears in the film multiple times as well. There's a lot of frames throughout the film where they just added Stan Lee in the background, like riding on a train or a subway or something like that. And but the final tribute is Stan Lee's signature tinted glasses on a black screen with a quote that says, "That person who helps others simply because it should or must be done and because it is the right thing to do is indeed, without a doubt, a real superhero." And that is one of Stan Lee's quotes. I've seen that attributed to him long before I saw it in Spider-Verse. I'm not sure where it originates from. I think it might have been from one of the original Stan's soapboxes. And it's a good quote. The idea that we should help people, that compassion for people that we should have. And I think that was a great thing to leave the world with. And, the idea of creating heroes that want to help other people because it's the right thing to do. Those are the characters that Stan Lee created. And that's the tenets that are still at the core of a lot of those characters. Yes, they're more than that as well. Like the Fantastic Four scientists, Spider-Man is the everyman. The X-Men are persecuted people. Daredevil is disabled. There's so much more to them all. But at the core, the thing that every single one of his heroes has in common is that they want to help people because it's the right thing to do. And I think a legacy of characters doing that, the modern mythology of comic books, it's a great thing to leave people. That's a hell of a legacy. And yeah, because of that message at the end of the film, as well as the thematic reference of that final cameo in the movie, that's why Spider-Verse is top of the list for me. It was his last cameo, but yeah, I think it was his best. And so that's my list. I originally wanted to get this episode out a lot earlier. I was ideally aiming for the end of December 2022 because that would have been Stan Lee's 100th birthday. And I felt that was a milestone to release this on. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I wasn't quite able to get it out then. And so I'm getting out now instead. Yeah. As I said, Stan Lee was he was like anyone. He was a complicated figure, but there's a lot of positivity associated with him and his work, and I think that's memorable. And yes, the negative stuff doesn't disappear just because he's passed. There was a quote by Lemmy of Motorhead when shortly before his own passing, where he said, people don't change because they're dead. People can still be arseholes. They're just dead arseholes. And it's important to remember that just because someone's died doesn't mean everything negative that can ever be said about them is gone. There were definitely things that were negative about Stan Lee. Some people have reported, some people he worked with have reported very negative experiences from their time working with him. But what he was a very skilled promoter, orator, storyteller, and he was able to win fans with his characters and with his with the stories that he told. Even the stories he told about the stories he told. The stories he told about how he came up with Spider-Man or how he came up with the Fantastic Four and things like that. And yeah, like I said before, the man has a good legacy to leave behind. These characters mean something to a lot of people, myself included. And I have Stan Lee to thank for breathing life into them. It's quite common that in comics especially, the best of a character doesn't always come from their original creator. A good example is Batman or Deadpool. The best things about those characters didn't come from the people that created them, but came from people who worked on them years later. The X-Men as well. Most of their best stuff comes from Chris Claremont. Spider-Man had plenty of great things added to him in later years. However, for the characters that Stan Lee created, while their best stuff may not necessarily come from him, so much of the core of what they are does. To the point that there is, everything that comes later just builds on that. It doesn't reinvent it, it just builds on what's already there. And that's true of Spider-Man, that's true of the Fantastic Four, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Daredevil, and so many others. So much of what is already there came from Stan Lee. So yeah, thank you, Stan.
Thank you, my friends, for once again joining me on Garhdo Goes Geek. Your continued support for this podcast means the absolute world to me, and I am grateful for every single one of you who stays and listens to one of my episodes. It means the absolute world. Now, if you would like to engage more with me or the podcast, we have a Discord community, small but growing, and we now have commissions open on Ko-Fi. So if there's a topic you would like to see me cover, you can pay me to cover it. All funds will be used for legal purchase of the relevant items where I do not have them. Have a look on the link tree for more information. Until next time, look after yourselves.